Experience intelligent HCI with HPE SimpliVity. Your business needs more than just ordinary hyperconverged infrastructure. Many HCI solutions streamline the customer experience with a healthy dose of automation. But to take your organization's day-to-day operations to the next level, and to be free of infrastructure hassles, data loss, and risk, you need more. My name is Chris McDonald, and I'm a technical account manager with Powerland. I'm here today to talk to you about HPE SimpliVity. So what we're going to do today is first we're going to review the demo infrastructure. We'll talk about the local and remote backup functionality, the data efficiency. We'll add an HPE StoreOnce appliance to the environment for external long-term backups, and add a compute-only node to extend the compute capabilities of our SimpliVity cluster without having to expand the storage capacity. So our HPE SimpliVity infrastructure is going to consist of two sites, Las Vegas and Tokyo. They will, of course, be connected via a network. Now that might be MPLS or a VPN. It might be SD-WAN. That's really up to each individual organization. We're going to have two HPE SimpliVity nodes in the Las Vegas location and one SimpliVity node in Tokyo. This is what we would call a 2+1 configuration. It's a valid configuration. In SimpliVity, we only need two nodes to be able to achieve RF3 or replication factor 3 protection. And that's because we use a combination of RAID on each node plus RAIN across the nodes. So within SimpliVity, we have a number of different t-shirt sizes, be that extra small, small, medium, large, and extra large. So from an extra small, small standpoint, each node is in a RAID 5 configuration. Medium, large, and extra large, they're in a RAID 6 configuration. And then, of course, we keep two copies of the data. So in this case, with two nodes, we'd have a VM. The primary source of the VM may be on node A, and it would also have a copy on node B, thereby giving us that ability to suffer multiple failures within a cluster. The single node in Tokyo is still protected because it still has RAID on the box. And that's one of the benefits of SimpliVity is you can deploy single node SimpliVity appliances in, say, a remote office or a remote location and still have all the functionality of SimpliVity with the same level of redundancy as if you were putting in just a standard 2U or 1U server. Now, we're going to show the local and remote backup functionality where I'm going to create backups locally on the two node Las Vegas cluster, and then of course backup to Tokyo as well, and vice versa. And then we're going to add an HPE StoreOnce appliance. That HPE StoreOnce appliance is there so we can create those more external long-term backups, thereby not using up the storage on our SimpliVity cluster nodes for those additional long-term backups. And then finally, we'll add a compute-only node to extend the compute capacity of our cluster without having to expand the storage capacity of our cluster. This is also very beneficial to organizations who want to move to a hyper-converged infrastructure, who already have servers on-prem that are still well within their life cycle. They might be in year 2 or year 3 of their life cycle. They can take those servers and add them into the SimpliVity environment to participate in sharing of that SimpliVity storage without having to expand and buy more SimpliVity nodes. In other words, you can continue to leverage the investment you've already made in those servers by incorporating them into your SimpliVity environment. And of course, that's done with no additional licensing. So let's take a look at the environment. So as I mentioned, we have Las Vegas and we have Tokyo. There are two nodes in Las Vegas and a single node in Tokyo in the remote cluster. Here we are. And there's a number of workloads that are running in either location. So what we're going to do is first we're going to talk about that backup functionality. Okay, so I'm going to start with just an ad hoc backup. So I'm going to select, say, for example, this Windows server. Now this Windows server, it's a 2012 server. It's currently consuming 494 gigs of storage in the environment. What I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on that server, and I'm going to go down to all SimpliVity actions. Now I mentioned before SimpliVity works with VMware. It's actually a plugin right into vCenter. And so therefore we have a right click contextual menu that pops up whenever we right click an item that the SimpliVity actions apply to. So here I have the all SimpliVity actions, and I want to back up this virtual machine. So I'm going to say I'm going to back up this virtual machine, and I'm just going to change the name here a little bit. I'll just add my initials, and I'll add a 0 on here as well, just to move it to the top of the list. Now, as you can see, I have a cluster or an external store option. The external store option is not available right now because the cluster does not have any external stores registered with it. Now that external store would be an HPE StoreOnce. If I drop down my clusters, I can see I can do my local cluster or my remote cluster, being Tokyo. I'm going to, for right now, say local cluster. I'm going to click next. And now I have two options, crash consistent or application consistent. Application consistent, obviously, that's important when we want to be able to restore to that exact point in time. So, but for right now, within this demo, we're going to select crash consistent. And I'm going to click on finish. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to expand my tasks here. And my SimpliVity backup completed. It was queued for 65 milliseconds, and it took about 4 seconds to complete. Now, how can I verify that? So I'm going to, again, right-click on that VM, go to All SimpliVity Actions, and I'm going to search backups. And as you can see, right now, I created this backup, LAVCM, to the local cluster. It is in a protected state. 494.1 gigs, but look at the unique backup size. That's because the actual VM, the data on the VM, since the last time it was backed up, which was backed up by a policy, by the way, hasn't changed. That's why my backup was so fast. Because of the way the data virtualization platform functions and the metadata it maintains, it's really just a pointer to those blocks, those objects within the object store. So I have a full 100% backup of that VM. It did not have to take a snapshot within VMware, so I do not suffer from VM stun, which is a common problem. And I now have my backup. So I'll close that, and I'll do the same thing. Again, I'll take another manual backup, except this time I'm going to go to the remote cluster. And I'll keep it crash consistent again, and I'll click on finish. So now this is going to take a little bit longer because in theory it's going across the wire to a remote location. But as you can see, it only took about 9 seconds to complete. Now once again, let's right click on that and search our backups. So here's my second backup. I forgot to rename it. You can see that it went to a remote cluster. The backup, the protected size was still 494.1 gigs, but it only sent 32.8 megabytes across the wire. Now, why did it take 32.8 megabytes? Because that's the amount of data that was unique between the Las Vegas site and the Tokyo site. All vendors are using deduplication. What's unique about this environment is that the deduplication is consistent across a SimpliVity federation. So a SimpliVity federation can consist of multiple clusters and multiple sites. Las Vegas and Tokyo are part of the same SimpliVity federation. Therefore, when they hash out the deduplication data, it is the same. It's using the same hash algorithm. So when we send data across the wire, it's sending that same information across the wire. If it exists at the other side, it is never going to copy that data again. So very efficient to be able to do that. Now I can, of course, do something similar, like go here and say I want to clone a virtual machine. So now I'm going to clone this virtual machine. So this is taking another exact copy. So this is, again, it's built on the same functionality as the backup, the local and remote backup functionality, except we're going to take a clone here. And I'm going to just call this CM1, and I'll make this 00. Again, it's crash consistent. It's still using that backup functionality. And I'll finish. And I'm going to rapidly clone that virtual machine. It's going to register the virtual machine. It probably takes longer to actually register the virtual machine than it does to actually clone it. And now I have a virtual machine. So I'll just reset that to green, and I'm going to start that VM. And right away, we can see that I now have a functional virtual machine cloned within seconds from my source. And again, remember, this VM was roughly 500 gigs in size. Very fast, very powerful. So we'll just wait for that. You can see that server now is already booted up and it's ready to be logged in. So we'll just close that. And of course, it's running VMware tools, so I can shut down the guest OS. Now, those were manual backups, but within SimpliVity, there are backup policies. So essentially, you have to have at least a backup policy, one backup policy. There may not be any rules within that policy, but there has to be at least one. As you can see here, we have a number of policies within our SimpliVity environment. I can create a new backup policy. I'll just call it demo. And you can see it has a rule. Every hour, it'll expire after a day. It's going to my local cluster. It backs up every day, and it starts at basically midnight. That's fine with me. So I'm going to say OK to that. So let's switch back to our hosts and clusters. And I'm going to start this back up again, just so that it's up and running. And I'm actually going to take a clone of a Linux VM as well for our demo purposes. And I'll just change that to CM and 00, so it goes to the top of the list. Crash consistent is fine. And finish. And there it's creating my VM. Keep an eye on our recent tasks to see what's been happening. Just reset that to green so we don't have to see that error. That error will, of course, resolve itself as I mentioned before. We have to have 2 copies of the data. So now that that new VM is up and running, it requires 2 copies of the data. So there is something that we refer to as data locality. So this particular VM is running on host 160. That means we have to take a copy of that data and make sure that it resides on host 161. So that storage HA component, that's why we receive that error, because it's still copying that data to the second host, making that second copy of that data. So let's start this guy up as well. So now we have 2 VMs that I've created, clones of other Windows VMs. It's not optimized, it's still copying that data. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this VM and I'm going to set the backup policy. So I'm going to select my policy and I'm going to select demo. And we can see here every hour of every day, and it will expire after a day, it is going to take a backup of this particular VM. And I'll do the same for the Linux. So now I have two VMs that are part of that policy. So once again, I'll just go up to Menu, SimpliVity Federation, Backup Policies, and I'll go back to my demo backup policy, and I have just one rule. So let's edit this backup policy. And I want to add a second rule. Same parameters, except I'm going to make sure it goes to the remote cluster in Tokyo. And I'll make this at 12:10 a.m. just so they're not right on top of one another. I'll save that, and I'll click OK. So now I have two rules. They happen every hour of every day. They expire after one day, so I'm not keeping an infinite number of copies. I'm keeping essentially 24 copies for each day. And one is going to my local cluster, and one is going to my remote cluster. So I'll switch back to SimpliVity Federation here. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm just going to make note of our cluster space summary. And this really refers to what we have for physical space, the deduplication and compression ratio, and the space saved. So realistically, the physical space that I have available within this cluster is only 5.25 terabytes. I am actually saving, or I'm storing, roughly 351 terabytes of data on that 5.25 terabytes. So let's just click on details here. And that's just going to take us to a different section within our plugin. And this is the HPE storage efficiency. And as you can see right here, I have virtual machines are taking up 10.33 terabytes. My remote backups are taking up 98 terabytes. And my local backups are taking up 246.51 terabytes. I'm getting a deduplication of 61.8 to 1 and a compression of 1.5 to 1 for an overall efficiency of 94.1 to 1. I have 5.25 terabytes of physical space, of which I am using 3.77 terabytes. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make one more backup so that we can see if this changes. I'll just leave it that way, and I'll say next, crash consistent, and say finish. So we'll go back to our recent tasks again. And we should have our backup is complete already. So let's search our backups. And there we have our backup at 11:08 a.m. That looks about right. Status right now is degraded. So it's still in process. Okay, so let's switch back to our backup policies, our demo policy. And as we saw, we have two rules within our policy. They happen every hour of every day, and they expire after one day. One rule is writing to the local cluster. The second rule is writing to the remote cluster. So what we're going to do now is we are going to add our external store. So I'm just going to go to the cluster, configure, HPE SimpliVity external storage. And as you can see right now, there aren't any HPE StoreOnce appliances currently registered within our SimpliVity environment. So I'm just going to switch to the HPE StoreOnce device, and I'll log in. Now, the user that I'm currently logged into this HPE StoreOnce device has observer only role, so I can't actually change anything. But what I'm going to do is talk about what we would normally do when we're performing this function. So I can see I have 3 Catalyst stores. So I'm going to click on Catalyst Stores. And the Las Vegas Catalyst is the StoreOnce Catalyst store that we're going to use. And I'm going to click on that. And that gives me some details, right? So right now there's 0 bytes of data stored. There's no dedupe ratio because, again, there's nothing being stored there. There are permissions. Now, right now, this is set for public access, which is enabled, okay? Typically, what you're going to do is you're not going to use public access because you want to restrict who can access this data store. So we would create a username and password to be able to connect to this device. Now, in this case, it is public access, and I can't add a user, so that's fine, as long as we know that in typical production environment, we would want to create a user to be able to access this Catalyst store, to be able to prescriptively define what systems can write to this device. So I'll switch back to our vCenter, and I'm going to click on Register Device. And I'm just going to type in the IP address. I'll just verify 308160. I'm going to put in the name, which was Las Vegas Catalyst. I'm still going to enter my username and password. And I'm going to click on Register. And now that store is registered with our SimpliVity cluster. So what I can do is I can come back, and I'm going to pick the Linux VM because it's a little smaller. It's 11.25 gigs. The reason I'm picking that is because there isn't any data currently within our Las Vegas Catalyst store to deduplicate against. So what that means is this very first backup, it has to actually move all of the data. But what I'm going to do is I'll right click, I'll go back down to HPE SimpliVity Actions, and I'll back up the virtual machine. Now, you're going to notice that, I'll just take away, I'll leave that there actually. I'll go External Store, and I can now select an external store. Never expires. Or I could set an expiration date, click on Next, again, crash consistent, and click Finish. So what we're going to see is this backup is going to take a little longer. Again, it has to now transfer 11.25 gigs from the SimpliVity storage to the external store as a backup. So what we can do is we can go search backups, and we can see that it's saving right now, okay? So I can come back here and I can refresh every once in a while to see just how much data has sent. It's going to take a few minutes, so we're going to come back to that. Now, with the external store, one thing I can't do is I can't come into the GUI at this present time and edit the backup policy and add a rule that includes the external store. And I'll show you what I mean by that. I only have my local and remote cluster as my options. So how do I then add the external store as part of my policy? Well, we can still do that. I'm going to go back to hosts and clusters. It says it's completed now, so let's just see. It's probably still working, but I want to double check. Search our backups. Still saving. It has transferred 5 gigs already. So it's still moving. It'll be another 2-3 minutes probably. So what we need to do to be able to add that external store to a backup policy, I need to log in to one of these 2 OmniStack virtual controllers. So I've got one here. Okay, now that I'm logged in, let me just type in SVT dash policy dash show dash dash policy demo. And that shows me that I have two rules. It's essentially the same information it showed me in the GUI. I have two rules, 0 and 1. One's going to the local cluster, one's going to the remote cluster. They have basically the same characteristics. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a rule to utilize the external store. So it takes a little bit to type all this in, but we'll get this in. If I could type correctly. So I'm going to set the frequency to 1 day. I'm going to have it run on Sunday. The start time will be 10 p.m. The end time will be 10 p.m. I'm going to retain, or the retention period will be 1 month, and that will be going to the external store, Las Vegas Catalyst. And the task is complete. So now let's just go up and do a SVT-policy-show for demo. And we should see now that we have 3 rules. 1 to the local, 1 to the remote cluster, and 1 to the Las Vegas Catalyst. That's going to happen daily. Well, frequency is day, happens at 10 p.m., but it only happens on Sundays. And it is going to retain that backup, in this case, for 4 weeks and 2 days. Okay? Because I said I want to keep it for 1 month. So now if I switch back to vCenter and I go Menu, SimpliVity Federation, Backup Policies, Demo, I can edit my backup policy. You'll see it's not available. I'm going to go to Summary. But what I can see right here is I have 3 rules. So now it has added in my rule. Okay, so that's one way that I can use my StoreOnce appliance to store long-term backups. Now that could have been for a month, or it could have been for a year, or it could have been for 5 years. That's up to me to decide. I just used a month as part of our demonstration. So now we're going to move on, and we are going to add this particular host to the SimpliVity cluster. So right now, this SimpliVity host, if I go to data stores, you can see it only has its local disk. I'll switch back up here to the local cluster. And I want to just double check. Sorry. I'm going to go to one of our SimpliVity data stores, which are all presented using NFS. I'm going to right click on that data store and go to SimpliVity Actions. And I'm going to manage standard ESXi hosts. It's a standard ESXi host because it's not a SimpliVity host. I'm going to select Share, and I'm going to click OK. And this is exactly how easy it is to tie in a physical standard ESXi host to a SimpliVity cluster. I'll do the same thing for Las Vegas too, because we do have 2 data stores, SimpliVity data stores. Manage, share, and click OK. Now if I switch back to hosts and clusters, and I come down to our BL600, you can see now I have access to the Las Vegas 01 and 02 data stores. So let's just try this, and I'll just shut down this guest. And that's going to shut down. And I can go to all SimpliVity actions and move that virtual machine. So as you can see, our compute-only node now has access to both the Las Vegas 01 and Las Vegas 02 data stores. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of our VMs, and I'm going to clone that VM. I'll make a clone of that VM, and we'll just call him CM2. Next. So now that that VM has been cloned, I'm going to take that VM, and I'm going to move this VM and change the compute node that it's running on. Retain the same VM network and finish. So now that VM is running, or will be running, on this BL600, connected to the VM network. It's about 500 gigs, and it's on the data store Las Vegas 01. And I'll just start that virtual machine up. And as you can see, that virtual machine is powering on and will now be running on our compute-only node. So now our virtual machine is powered on, and our compute-only node is functioning and participating in utilizing the storage available from our SimpliVity nodes. So what we're going to do is we're just going to check on our data efficiency. So let's go back up to our cluster, monitor, scroll down, storage efficiency, and I'll just move this down a little bit, and you can see that our deduplication has gotten a little bit better, and so has our overall efficiency. Our backups have changed, and our virtual machine data has changed. But realistically, our actual physical usage hasn't changed by all that much. Of course, this particular VM can be part of a backup policy as well. Now, the beauty is, I'm going to set that. The beauty is any change I make up to that backup policy applies instantly to all 3 of those VMs that are part of that policy. So if I had 1, 10, 100, 1,000 VMs that were associated with a backup policy, any change I make to that backup policy is automatically reflected on all of those virtual machines. So I don't have to go and make a lot of changes to my backup policies or to my VMs to get them to back up differently. So that brings us to the conclusion of today's video. Please, if you like what you've seen, please subscribe and click like. Click on that notification button as well so you can get notified when the second part of this SimpliVity demo video comes out, in which we'll be discussing SimpliVity's Rapid Disaster Recovery product. Thanks very much.